Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian. Let's now turn to one of China's core interests, a top priority in the words of Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony of the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, national security. He said national security is the bedrock of national rejuvenation, and social stability is a prerequisite for building a strong and prosperous China. We must, he said, resolutely pursue a holistic approach to national security and promote national security in all areas and stages of the work of the party and the country, so as to ensure national security and social stability, end of quote. China will also improve the mechanism for the country's participation in global security governance and advance the Peaceful China Initiative. So how will these efforts help China better shore up its national security foundation? How can China better play its role in global security governance? For deeper insights, my interview with Zhou Bo, a senior fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy with Tsinghua University. I'm joined by Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow from the Center for International Security and Strategy with Tsinghua University. Senior Colonel Zhou, good to see you.
Thank you, Tian.
The opening ceremony of the 20th CPC Congress won a lot of international spotlight. On the issue of national defense, people are looking at how is China waving that question into the overall logic change China has been illustrating over the past few years about how it looks at the future of the world. Senior Colonel Zhou, your thoughts?
I think the tone of this report, compared with the past ones, is unprecedented great in tone. I think this has a lot to do with how China would assess the international environment. Because in the past, we actually have been talking about peace and development being the theme over the time for decades. But now we talk about how the world actually is at a crossroad. For PLA, I think I'm most impressed with a proposal, with actually instruction from President Xi to speed up the process of building PLA into a world-class military. In the previous reports, we only talk about PLA in world-class military by mid-century. But now we have to speed up this process and invite a question, how much speed we should actually be to actually work on this process.
Yeah.
We have a long time, we still have 28 years. So how many years before the mid-century? And how can we work to achieve that? This would involve a lot of questions.
What about that timetable?
I think previously it is clearly earmarked in terms of the targets on the roadmap. That is to become basically modernized in 2035 and to become a world-class military by mid-century. So the war actually in Ukraine raised a very interesting question. Then how strong is the PLA now? I would say this is China PLA is almost like a world-class military. PLA, at least in terms of the number of ships, is actually having more ships than the US Navy. And if we compare all the ships combined of the British Royal Navy, you would find that it is actually smaller than even one fleet of PLA Navy, be it the South China Sea Fleet or Eastern China Sea Fleet. So the only question about the PLA's combat capability is that it is not combat tested in the last 4 decades, because we have not entered into a single war after 1979. But that, however, would not suggest that the PLA could not fight. If we have guts to find the strongest enemy in Korean War in 1950, nowadays, of course, we're much stronger, and this is absolutely evident in now unprecedented blockade over the Taiwan Island after Nancy Pelosi's visit. This is a showcase of our military capability. The roadmap for PLA is very clear because we have already achieved mechanization in 2020. And the next target is 2035, when we become basically modernized. And then we will move on to become a world-class military by mid-century. That was the plan of the past. But now, according to President Xi's report, his instruction is clear. We have to speed up this process of becoming world-class military. That means, in my personal understanding, we cannot wait until mid-century to become a world-class military. Then how fast can you move? And how many years in advance can you become world-class military? These are questions. But I'm confident about the results. Why? Because if you compare the PLA with foreign armed forces, I would say PLA is very much close to world-class military. Because for many countries, probably they already consider PLA a world-class military.
Well, right before the Chinese Party Congress, we see the U.S. Unveil the national security strategy, looking at China as the rival. Now, Mr. Zhou, how do you see China's own interpretation of the security situation vis-a-vis others, especially the U.S. interpretation of how it wants China to be in its relations with the U.S.?
The United States has actually termed China as a primary strategic competitor. And in this national security strategy, President Biden actually said that China has both intention and capability to reshape the international order in its favor. I think this very important general assessment is wrong, in that China is not trying to reshape the international order. Because what is the international order? International order, of course, is about rules and regimes, but it is also about the coexistence of a different system, different religions, different philosophy, and different culture. And the world, ever since day one, is like this. It is always the coexistence of different countries with different culture, different religions. So what is exactly the international order? You cannot say that the international order is a Western-led international order. And China actually has been so much involved in globalization. So if we are talking about rules and regime, I can hardly think of even one agreement that China has not entered. So it's difficult for me to think of that. If you are talking about China's unique social system, yes, I agree. This political system is different, but we have vowed not to export our social system and ideology. So how come that we have the intention to reshape the international order?
Of course, people remember the biggest round of applause at the opening ceremony of the 20th CPC Party Congress is when Xi Jinping talked about the situation in Taiwan, and also China is determined that the issue of Taiwan will not be decided by outside forces and also interrupters. But so how do you see, Senior Colonel Zhou, the message that round of applause is sending both to the Chinese military and also to the role of the military in terms of the Taiwan question?
When the foreigners talk about Taiwan issues, they always exaggerate the so-called potential of China using military forces against Taiwan. But in this report, President Xi has still made it very clear that it is in our interest, to have utmost sincerity, to make utmost efforts to have peaceful reunification with Taiwan. But we cannot relinquish use of force, and this is not against a compatriot in Taiwan. It's against a handful of separatists in Taiwan. So I think this is a balanced approach towards this issue. But first and foremost, we have utmost sincerity to have a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. Because that is the most clear message.
How is the PLA looking at the expansion of NATO and also looking at the U.S. and its allies putting ever more joint military cooperation in the areas surrounding China?
NATO has expanded to the extent that it actually has come to the brink of nuclear war because of what it did itself. So I believe basically NATO has already reached the end of its expansion. On the list of NATO's potential candidates, there are only three members. One is Georgia, another is Ukraine, and the third is Bosnia and Herzegovina. For Georgia and Ukraine, Georgia had a war with Russia. Ukraine is having a war with Russia. So these two countries, I don't believe, will join NATO. And for Bosnia, maybe it can join NATO in the future, in the distant future, but being a small country, it won't matter that much. But I think it is most important, for Russia not to use nuclear weapons, because Russian armed forces is not fighting so well. So people really are worried if Russia only has nuclear weapons left in his hand, probably the temptation would just go higher for Russia to use nuclear weapons.
So, Senior Colonel Zhou, looking at the Russia-NATO situation, how is China's military, from your perspective, Senior Colonel Zhou, looking at the situation there and try to separate the propaganda from both sides and beyond with the real content of the warfare?
The only question about PLA is that everybody agrees PLA is growing from strength to strength, but they don't know how strong PLA really is, because PLA has not entered in a war after 1979. But, we have showcases so many new equipment and weaponries in Tiananmen Square Parade. And I believe the most telling example is military exercises that was a kind of de facto blockade of Taiwan after Nancy Pelosi's visit. And this kind of demonstration is not only a political demonstration, it's also an unprecedented demonstration of a growing military capability.
So I want to quote here Senior Colonel Zhou. Defense Minister of China Wei Fenghe said recently China was running into severe and grave national security conditions, and he emphasized on implementing, quote, strengthening the military and improving its ability to win. How much do you see this will be translated into a recent years' development of the Chinese military?
I think there is no need for anybody to tell PLA that you are facing a serious situation. We're fully aware of that. And that is why we're actually working on it to enhance our capability around the clock. Actually, in this report of the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, the clear instruction is on PLA to speed up, this process of military build-up. So I think we are fully aware of the situation, and we will try our utmost to enhance our capability. But because of the whole strength of China being the second largest economy and being the largest industrial nation, being a country that could virtually produce all types of weapons, and being a country that could afford to have, if necessary, further investment in our military. So I'm confident about the strength of PLA.
What about in China's neighborhood? The U.S., obviously, according to the latest reports, trying to build a strong military alliance in the neighborhood of China. But there is also an issue of balance that China has to make sure of. That is, on the one hand, be able to improve its capabilities to win when there were issues threatening China's security. However, on the other hand, it also needs to build a good neighborly relations with the countries around. So, Senior Colonel Zhou, how do you see the Chinese military trying to articulate this balance?
The bigger background of your remarks is actually America's Indo-Pacific strategy, because I believe America's Indo-Pacific strategy is actually a reflection of America's declined strengths. The fact is, after the Second World War, American GDP accounts for half of the world, and now it is just 25% of the world. And about 40% Americans now are talking about a civil war, from being likely to very likely. So this is alarming even for outsiders like me, to see how Americans actually do not have a lot of confidence in the future. So I believe the Indo-Pacific strategy actually is a kind of strategy of retrenchment.
How is China articulating both improving the capabilities to win and also build the neighborly relations in the neighborhoods?
PLA nowadays is really charting the growth, especially with such activity like China piracy. Because ever since the end of 2008, we have been sending flotillas non-stop. Yeah, and they do not only operate in Asia, they're also operating in the international waters elsewhere. Yeah, so this is for the PLA Navy and for PLA peacekeeping forces. Yeah, we have about 2,500 peacekeepers around the world in different missions. Again, that's a good exercise or training for them. And from time to time, we will send your troops to do disaster relief, and we also send a hospital ship that provide a free medical service to people in different continents. Of course, internally or domestically, we are sparing no efforts to make ourselves stronger. Yeah, we have almost all types of weapons. What we need to do is just to make a better use of this weapon, to know how to use them during a real war situation.
My last question, we haven't seen the military budget increase according to the latest report. Now, how do you articulate this vis-a-vis other countries' spending on the military?
That's a very good question, because China's defense expenditure this year is actually announced after the war in Ukraine. And it is still less than 2%, as in decades. And it is lower than 2% GDP of NATO standard. What does it tell you? It tells you that here the Chinese government, in spite of these challenges, is confident about its own capabilities. During the Cold War, the British defense expenditure could reach even 6%. Yeah, but that was during the Cold War. And now, even in spite of all these challenges, in spite of the South China-American relationship, our defense expenditure is more or less still the same.